Hey everyone, we're here for our next session, which is with Meltem. It'll be on why mining matters, and I'll let her take it from here.
All right, thanks so much for having me today at Macros. I'm excited to be here. So it's a crazy time in the world. And one of the things I wanted to talk about, I know there's a lot of conversation around cryptocurrencies, digital assets, DeFi, the many exciting things happening in our space. One of the things I always love to do is connect different ideas, different industries. In my prior life, before I worked in the crypto space, I used to work in the energy industry. And the energy industry is obviously very different from the crypto industry in many ways, but there are some fundamental linkages between cryptocurrencies, the energy industry, and also the nature of politics and power in our world. Obviously, one of the aspirations of Bitcoin in particular is the separation of money and state. And I don't think we can really talk about the separation of money and state without talking about the nature of power and conflict in our world. So as I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about today and share with you all today, I thought it would be useful to talk about why Bitcoin mining matters. And today I'm going to talk about silicon in the form of semiconductors, Satoshis, or Bitcoin, and global superpowers. Just a brief caveat for the purpose of this talk, I am going to focus primarily on Bitcoin. Obviously, my interest is not exclusive to only Bitcoin, but with Bitcoin still being over 50% of the market cap of all cryptocurrencies, that focus just makes it a bit easier for me to really delve deep on the dynamics of Bitcoin. And obviously, Bitcoin's proof of work consensus algorithm is an important part of what I'll be talking about today. So before I start, a quick caveat, my compliance team needs me to disclose and disclaim that basically I own Bitcoin, I hold Bitcoin, I have exposure to Bitcoin. I may have exposure to some of the companies I talk about, some of the logos on these slides. All of my investments are disclosed on my personal website, meltemdemirors.com. But obviously, I personally also am an investor in Bitcoin, which is why I'm here talking about it. And then as we go through this talk, if you have questions or comments, I think we have about 30 minutes, but I always like for these things to be interactive. So feel free to use the comment bar, ask questions, add comments, feel free to disagree with me. I think conflict and tension is always good. I'd love for you to tell me why I'm wrong or ask me your tough questions. So with that, let's just quickly talk about the nature of power in our world. This is one of my favorite topics to talk about. And really what I want to highlight here is power in our world is changing. As I mentioned, I started my career in the energy industry. And when I graduated college in 2009, I went and worked in the energy industry. At that time, in 2009, what you see on the left-hand side of the slide, the largest companies in our world in 2009 were companies who made, manufactured, and distributed physical things. I spent a long time working at ExxonMobil for the corporate treasurer, but as you can see, Shell, Petrobras, a number of these companies were engaged in the manufacture of physical things and fueling the physical part of our world. Combined, these 10 largest companies had a market cap of 2.3 trillion. In 2020, and I haven't updated this for 2021, which I really should, I apologize. But in 2020, the 10 largest companies in our world are listed on the right-hand side. And what you'll note is none of these companies produce anything physical. These are companies who dominate the digital realm and the finance realm. And more importantly, the combined market cap of these companies is now 7.5 trillion, or it's about 3.3 times what it was 10 years ago, which is a result of financialization or the accrual of gains, not to real world assets, but to financial assets. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that matters. But really the shift we've seen in the last 10 years is the nature of power in our world has fundamentally shifted. The most powerful companies in our world today are intermediaries. They're companies that control our access to our digital lives and our financial lives. Now, what's interesting to note is this revolution is continuing to march on. In 2009, energy, industrials, and banking dominated the world. In 2021, internet, tech, and payments dominate the world. And in my view, the next decade of power in our world will be defined by the quest for cheap and abundant energy, compute and connectivity resources, and a new type of financial activity. And so I've listed out some of the companies that I think will be interesting to watch, Tesla, NVIDIA, Stripe, and others. But I think Bitcoin, again, has a really important role to play here. Companies and nations alike are going to spend trillions of dollars on R&D, intellectual property, and physical infrastructure that is needed to secure their data and their ability to access global systems. And I'm going to talk a bit more about what that means. Cyberspace really is the next frontier. And as we migrate from the physical world defined by physical borders and jurisdiction into the digital world, which is borderless and really doesn't have jurisdiction, there's going to be a tremendous amount of value that will be captured. And the question is, who is going to capture that value? So one thing I talk about often is our digital overlords. If we look on the left-hand side, the growth of the digital economy over the last decade has really been profound. This is data from NBER. It's recent as of 2018. This is a data set that's available via the US Fed site. And what we've seen is, as a percentage share of GDP, the digital economy has grown significantly. And in fact, over the last year alone, as a result of the COVID-19 crisis, we've seen an even bigger increase in the amount of economic activity that can be attributed to the digital realm. Now, again, as I alluded to, the gains and the economic activity resulting from that shift from physical to digital hasn't accrued evenly, though. The majority of the gains and the majority of the economic growth has been attributed directly to a small number of companies who I call our digital overlords. And you see that reflected in the chart on the right. Today, fully 20% of the S&P 500 market cap is comprised of just 5 companies. Apple alone commands a market cap of over $2 trillion, which is just absolutely astronomical and insane to think about. And so what's been really interesting to observe is, like, yes, our lives are becoming more digital, but at the same time, our digital lives and that digital growth has been disproportionately captured by a select few companies. And so really the question here becomes, what are the implications for the balance of power in our world? So let's talk briefly about what's happening in politics, and in particular, geopolitical conflict. So I like to call this the $1 trillion whale. If anyone read the book about the 1MDB scandal and Joe Low, it was called the $1 billion whale. I call this problem the $1 trillion whale. Technology spend by governments continues to grow as we've seen increased amount of activity shifting from the physical world to the digital world. Now, I'm going to focus on the United States because it really is the granddaddy of spending. We spend trillions of dollars a year on national defense. And the US Department of Defense has just initiated a cloud procurement campaign on unprecedented scale. Over the last 12 months alone, there are 2 contracts that have been allocated that are worth over $18 billion. The DEOS contract worth $8 billion and the JEDI contract worth $10 billion. On the left-hand side, you'll see the logos of the companies who competed for this contract. And in fact, some of those companies are now suing the US government because they did not win these federal contracts, which is quite interesting. But the other thing I'll add is that the federal government in the United States expects to spend over $100 billion on cloud compute and cloud services over the next several years. And in fact, we are now reaching an inflection point. Historically, weapons manufacturers were the largest contractors to the US government. So Raytheon, Halliburton, Northrop Grumman, companies who produced physical weapons to implement physical violence. They are no longer the largest suppliers to the US Department of Defense. In fact, Amazon Web Services has become one of the largest military contractors in the United States, which I think just underscores the critical importance of this migration from the physical realm to the digital realm. So what are the implications of this? Why is this happening? Well, securing cyberspace is an entirely new frontier. It's a whole new game. Historically, there's a bad guy. You know where the bad guy or gal is located. You go to their physical location, you harm them with physical violence, end of story. In this new world in cyberspace, that doesn't exist. On the internet, you could be interacting with anyone. There are both state actors and non-state actors that are infiltrating not only systems, but hardware supply chains that are fueling this compute infrastructure. And as a result, the number of attack vectors have increased exponentially. And the attack vectors are no longer just government systems. They're also our financial systems, their data systems, their identity systems, their hospital systems. There are a number of really critical components of national infrastructure, some of which are publicly owned, some of which are privately owned, that are going to be vectors of attack for both state and non-state actors that are operating in cyberspace. And so as a result, it's created an entirely new playing field in which a whole new type of warfare is unfolding. And digital space really is a new political frontier. Let's just talk really quickly about what's happening in this frontier. One trend you may have noticed recently is all of the things that are happening in terms of government funding and tax incentives for people building digital infrastructure. Over the summer, there was an announcement that TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor, which is one of the largest chip fabs in the world, is building a $12 billion chip plant in Arizona, which will be the biggest onshoring of semiconductor R&D and semiconductor fab in recent US history. As a result, TSMC has been awarded a number of tax incentives and tax grants to engage in this. US lawmakers over the summer as well proposed a $23 billion bill to aid the US semiconductor industry. Investors have been flocking to invest in data centers as the amount of data produced, stored, and managed onshore in the US continues to grow, and people have become much more sensitive to the physical jurisdiction in which their data resides. And lastly, one important trend is Huawei. In February of last year, Huawei is one of the largest hardware manufacturers in the world, but very importantly, Huawei is one of the largest producers of 5G telecommunications hardware. Huawei was hit with RICO charges by the US Department of Justice, the DOJ. RICO charges, if you'll recall, were historically reserved for members of the mob and the JP Morgan Metals desk. RICO stands for racketeering and organized crime. So basically, this is an unprecedented move by the DOJ to levy basically racketeering charges against a foreign technology company, Huawei, for basically interfering and stealing IP and installing malware and spyware in US physical telecommunications infrastructure. And again, if you want to read up on this, I've written a number of blog posts on this topic. There's also a number of great resources out there, but this digital space that we're now operating in presents a massive amount of surface area for attacks, and it's prevalent in every part of our economy, it's prevalent in our physical supply chains, prevalent in how we consume data and services, and we're just really starting to grapple with this new reality. And my view is governments are completely unprepared for what is coming next. And this is already being reflected by some of the dynamics we see at play in global supply chains. Over the last few months, something really interesting has been unfolded. There's a massive shortage of semiconductors in the world. Semiconductors are chips, basically, they're a key input in many manufacturing processes. But the semiconductor shortage is playing out notably in the automotive industry, where Ford, Volvo, and a number of other automakers have actually had to shut down plants because they don't have enough of the semiconductor components that they need to produce cars. And in fact, in Germany, automakers went to Merkel's government and said, you need to go lobby with the Chinese government to get us these semiconductor components we need to produce cars. So this is a really interesting place where you wouldn't naturally assume there's a link between the automotive industry and the semiconductor industry. But again, the inability to have access to the semiconductor supply chain and to lock in supply of these critical components is leading to actual economic damage and a shutdown of a key component of both the US and German economy, the automotive industry. So we're already starting to see this play out. And these are the mythical creatures of our day and age, right? If you use hardware in any way, shape, or form, here are some of the hardest pieces of hardware to get in the market today. The RTX 3090 is a new GPU that came out from NVIDIA in November. It's supposed to retail for $1999. It's currently selling for prices from anywhere from $2,500 to $4,000, and it's impossible to find. It took me 4 weeks to find one one, and I ended up paying a premium to retail price. The AMD Ryzen chip is a new CPU that came out from AMD a few months ago. That chip is impossible to find. And then here's an example of two miners. We have an S9 and a What's Miner M30. And so these have also been really hard to find. In fact, at Coinshares, we recently invested in Compass Mining, which is a marketplace for buying new and used ASICs and GPUs and installing them in co-location facilities. And the ASIC market, even on the secondary market, we're seeing old deprecated hardware retailing for a significant premium just because there is such a shortage of compute hardware. So this war has already started. I think we're just unaware that we're in this war, and it's playing out not only in the crypto space, but in a number of different industries. And every industry today has a compute component or a hardware component. So let me just start to connect some of this together for you. So if we think about the nature of global conflict, really since World War II up through the 2010s and the end of the Bush era, we lived in a world that was defined by the quest for one scarce resource, and that resource was oil. What that resulted in from a global political landscape perspective is we fought wars to secure access to oil, and we saw a lot of conflict in oil-rich regions. We saw a shift in 1971 off the gold standard and the rise of the petrodollar as a result of this. The OPEC cartel was formed as a direct response to this. And we saw the fragmentation of the world into OPEC and non-OPEC member states, which also resulted, by the way, in a number of sanctions and economic violence in the form of sanctions and for currency controls. And really, in this era, oil super majors ruled the world. I used to work for one, at the time I worked for Exxon, it was the largest corporation in the world. And that is no longer the case, not by a long shot. Today, the era we live in is a very, very different era. And my belief is, and again, this is just my armchair pontification here, but my belief is in this new era that we are about to enter into, the scarce resource that will define man's quest for control and power is semiconductors, compute, and connectivity. We will fight wars to secure access to rare earth metals and other material inputs, as well as semiconductor fab. We will shift away from the petrodollar to a multipolar currency world, and this has already happened. And when I say multipolar currency world, what's interesting to note is we're no longer just talking about nation states. We're also talking about corporations who are now larger than nation states in some cases, as I alluded to with Apple, $2 trillion company, as well as the nation state of Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a $1 trillion economy with millions of people around the world who have self-selected to be a part of that digital nation state. We're seeing the rise of our tech overlords who are more powerful in many instances than governments themselves. And semiconductor fabs are going to rule the world. They already do. We're just not aware of it yet because they haven't flexed that muscle yet. So I've just provided a lot of context, and you're probably sitting here asking, well, get to the point, Meltem. Why are we talking about this? So let's talk about Bitcoin and how Bitcoin fits into this story. If we look at the Bitcoin value chain, I think, is one that we don't talk about enough. In Bitcoin, there are really 4 key steps in the Bitcoin value chain. You create a transaction. You broadcast that transaction. That transaction is then validated and propagated, and then it's verified and it's batched into a block and mined, right? And this is how the Bitcoin network functions at its core level. Now, what's interesting to note is as we move from left to right, what we're doing is we're starting on the software side, but as we migrate to the right and broadcast, validate, and verify transactions, we actually require physical hardware and access to compute to perform these functions. And so the way I sort of frame this is as we move from left to right, we go from CapEx heavy, or software to CapEx heavy or infrastructure driven activity, pardon. And so the implications here are actually really profound and really interesting. So let me share why. What's really interesting about Bitcoin is no matter how efficient you are, you can never produce more Bitcoin than the block size reward. And so the surface area for innovation in Bitcoin and in terms of efficiency really falls into 3 key areas: technology innovation, business model innovation, and financial innovation. And I'll talk more about why this matters. But Bitcoin hardware is required in order for this value chain to work. And in Bitcoin and in crypto generally, we focus so much on the software side that I think we forget that the Bitcoin network has a physical instantiation. And the Bitcoin network is the world's largest privately owned telecommunications network. And this is profound. So what's interesting to note is, again, there are all of these fundamental components in the Bitcoin value chain that require hardware. And as I've just talked about, hardware is one of the key components in this new battlefront, this new political battlefront for control of the digital realm. And Bitcoin is not excluded from this. So I'll just skip through this quickly. What is really interesting to me, and what I want to just put in your mind today again, is as we start to understand the fundamental linkage between energy, hardware, infrastructure, and Bitcoin and cryptographic networks. And as we begin to refine this relationship between physical assets and the maintenance and management of the Bitcoin network as a communication protocol, firms and nation states are going to compete to secure access to the Bitcoin network. I'm just going to let you think about that for a minute. Bitcoin effectively is a mechanism where you can use electricity and access to hardware to price network security. And you can see on this chart here, the purple line is Bitcoin's hash rate and the blue line is Bitcoin's price. Bitcoin's fundamental security measure as a network is the hash rate. Bitcoin is very transparent about its energy usage because its energy usage is one of the fundamental security guarantees that keeps Bitcoin secure. Right? Attacking the Bitcoin network is computationally and energetically extremely expensive, which is what gives proof of work its value as a consensus mechanism, right? So as Bitcoin's value continues to increase, as Bitcoin's monetary importance, monetary weight continues to increase, the amount of resource going into maintaining Bitcoin's security through hash rate on the physical network is also going to increase. And what this means from a political perspective is that Bitcoin really is going to become an incredibly important part of our global financial infrastructure, but also our global political infrastructure. And here's the thought I want to leave you with. Today, Bitcoin lives in the realm of finance. And the way we talk about Bitcoin is as money or as a monetary asset. But Bitcoin is so much more than that. Bitcoin, for the first time, has given us the ability to price the demand for compute and connectivity. If I want my transaction to be processed faster, I attach a higher fee to my Bitcoin transaction. So for the first time, what we're able to do is explicitly price our desire to utilize a compute network, which happens to be the Bitcoin network. And on top of that, because the maintenance of the Bitcoin network requires two fundamental inputs, silicon and electricity, we're also effectively creating a new type of market for energy. Bitcoin is effectively a money battery that allows us to transform energy and silicon into monetary value. And there are many regions in the world where a tremendous amount of renewable energy is produced that cannot be effectively utilized by industry to create new types of economic value. And in these regions of the world, what we're seeing is a tremendous amount of shift of using that energy for Bitcoin mining, because these nation states and these energy producers have recognized that Bitcoin is a fantastic way to take this energy that cannot be utilized in other economically valuable processes and utilize it to create monetary value in the form of Bitcoin. I'll add one more layer to that. So as energy, compute, and connectivity and Bitcoin's monetary promises start to come together, there's also an important layer of cybersecurity that starts to become really relevant. Bitcoin is the most secure financial network in the world today. And as we continue to see cyber threats face many other financial networks in our world, Fedwire, Swift getting hacked, banking systems getting hacked. The importance of Bitcoin as a secure communication layer for monetary value will become more and more important. And so it is my belief that over the course of the next decade, Bitcoin will become an important part of the military-industrial complex, which is a crazy idea. But if we think about the nature of politics and power in our world, and the shift from a dollar-denominated world to a multipolar currency world where we see new factions vying for power, it starts to become very apparent. The growth of communication technology, beyond just providing bandwidth and routing in the form of Bitcoin, adds a level of discretion to how we utilize hardware and deploy software. And Bitcoin is really the perfect expression of this. If we can control what is communicated, how it's communicated, and who it's communicated to, this is going to be of vital importance to companies and states who are operating on the Bitcoin network. And so really my vision for the future is that in time, more and more of our world and more of power in our world is going to look like this: data centers. We consume and create and generate more data, more compute than ever before. And our energy usage is only going to increase as the amount of compute and connectivity we require continues to increase. What Bitcoin does is create a market for energy consumption and secure compute and connectivity, unlike any that we've ever seen before. And so I'm very excited about starting to bring these ideas together in a cogent way. And I think the first nation state that really takes Bitcoin mining seriously and invests in securing the Bitcoin network will have a significant advantage on the political arena as Bitcoin's importance in the realm of not just money, but secure compute and connectivity continues to grow. So I'll pause there. I got a question from Michelle. He says, do you see wars taking on a shape of proxy conflicts over rare metal-rich regions of the world? Does not seem to bode well for Africa. And then a second question around silicon deposits in different parts of the world. So Michelle, to your point, the proxy conflicts for rare earth metals have already played out. And the way it's played out is in the form of China's Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI. China has effectively financed major industrial infrastructure in over 140 countries through its Belt and Road Initiative, which it's deployed over the last 5 to 10 years. And the implementation of digital renminbi, or DCP, is not just about payments infrastructure or the consumer economy. It's really about making sure that global supply chains are dominated by Chinese financing and Chinese-owned infrastructure. And this, again, has already happened, right? What's so interesting to me is people are talking about this war and hypotheticals. It's already happened, and the West has already lost the war. And so this, it sounds a little bit dystopian, but I think, again, as we look at where the future is going, the future is digital. The future is all about technology and compute and connectivity. And unfortunately, the United States and Western Europe have lacked the political cohesion, the financial capital, or the willpower to do anything about it. And as a result, I think there's going to be a dramatic shift in power in our world as we see that Western nations can't cope with this new reality. I mean, look, over the last 12 months, we've seen the incompetence of our governments laid bare. We can't even have coordinated action on a matter of national life or death, right? The COVID-19 crisis. So again, for me, as I look at where power in the world is headed and who's thinking strategically about where we're going, not very encouraging. And I think certainly these proxy wars have already played out, and they're financial wars. And really, it's all about who owns this infrastructure and who can control access to this infrastructure. The U.S. has long enjoyed the ability the U.S. has long enjoyed the ability to implement not just physical violence, but economic violence in the form of sanctions. But as the U.S. dollar continues to sort of lose its global importance and as new alternatives like Bitcoin, but also other currencies emerge, I think the ability for the U.S. to implement economic violence in the form of sanctions is also going to be greatly diminished. And that tool, which has been so powerful in dominating the landscape for natural resources, is going to be deprecated and ultimately no longer be useful. Another question from Aaron, are you open to working on published work on this? Yeah, sure. Always happy to. I publish a lot of my thoughts online. But if anyone wants to collaborate, happy to. I think we don't talk about the political and national security implications of Bitcoin enough. And then Stephen raises a really great point. The BRI over the last 10 years has cost China $140 billion. And 1.9 trillion is the latest US stimulus. A lot of that, by the way, is going to private corporations, not even to public good. So yeah, Stephen, I have a lot of questions about what the fuck it is that people in Washington, D.C. are actually doing. I'm not overly optimistic, which is why I'm working on Bitcoin, why I'm excited about Bitcoin and what we're building here. But at the end of the day, I think we live in a very different world than the one we think we live in. And it's going to be very interesting to see how it evolves over the next decade. I certainly have my view on where I'm spending my time and investing my energy. But I think, again, I'd encourage everyone who's involved in the cryptocurrency space to not only focus on software, but to really think about the physical instantiation and the physical nature of how digital products and goods and networks are created, because there are very important implications for how we think about where we invest our time, our energy, and how we build relationships with people who control access to those resources. So with that, I'll pause here. Hopefully this has been interesting for you and been a slightly different take on things. I recognize some of my views are maybe a bit alarmist. And if anyone wants to chat more, please feel free to reach out to me. Let me share my email. It's md@coinshares.com. Feel free to shoot me a note. And then if you'd like to learn more, we do have a lot of great research available on our website, www.coinshares.com. Thank you so much for having me today.
Thanks, Meltem. This was fantastic. We're going to transition to our next session now. And thanks again.
Thanks.